In the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, where winter claims more lives than bullets and the law bends to the weight of gold, a promise was made that would change everything. When a giant of a man looked down at a trembling widow clutching her 4-year-old daughter and spoke those impossible words, "By spring you'll carry my 3 sons," it wasn't just a vow of protection. But before we journey into the Colorado wilderness of 1885, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a declaration of war against those who prey on the innocent, a commitment that would test the very limits of what one man could sacrifice for love, justice, and the chance at redemption. Some promises are whispered in moonlight and forgotten by dawn. Others are forged in fire and sealed with blood. This is the story of Marcus "Bull" Henderson, a man whose gentle heart beat inside a frame that could break horses and bend iron, and Sarah Mitchell, a schoolteacher whose quiet strength concealed secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. Together they would discover that sometimes the most impossible promises are the only ones worth keeping. The first snow of October fell like ash across the peaks of the Colorado Rockies, each flake a whispered warning that winter was coming early this year. Marcus Henderson stood at the edge of his cabin's covered porch, watching the white veil descend over Pine Ridge Valley far below. At 6 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to yoke oxen and hands that could palm a man's head like a child's ball, Marcus cut an imposing figure against the mountain landscape. But those who looked closely might notice the gentleness in his dark brown eyes, the careful way he moved to avoid startling the wildlife that had grown accustomed to his presence, the precise manner in which he repaired rather than replaced the things that time and weather had damaged. 3 years of solitude had taught him to read the mountain's moods like scripture, the way the wind shifted from west to north, carrying the scent of snow and something else, smoke but not the clean burn of hearth fires. This smoke carried the acrid tang of destruction, of things burning that were never meant to burn. Marcus's weathered hand moved unconsciously to the scar that ran along his left forearm, a reminder of the mine collapse that had taken everything from him. His wife Elena, his twin boys Miguel and Gabriel, barely 2 years old when the Mountain King mine's tunnel gave way, the same mine whose owners had known the supports were failing, whose supervisors had sent men to their deaths rather than lose a day's profit. The wind carried another sound now, faint but unmistakable to ears trained by years of cattle drives and mountain living. Hoofbeats, moving fast, pushing hard up the treacherous trail that led to his hidden valley. Marcus frowned, stepping back into the cabin to retrieve his rifle from above the stone fireplace. Visitors were rare in this remote corner of the territory, and those who came usually brought trouble with them. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was difficult to find, harder to reach, and impossible to approach without being seen. Moving with surprising quiet for such a large man, Marcus positioned himself behind the thick trunk of an ancient pine that dominated his front yard. The tree was old when the first miners had arrived in Colorado, its gnarled branches having weathered decades of storms and seasons. From this vantage point, he could see the narrow switchback trail that was the only approach to his cabin, while remaining hidden from view. The riders appeared first as shadows moving between the trees, then resolving into distinct figures as they climbed higher. 3 horses, 2 carrying double. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle, his black coat and high collar marking him as someone of importance, someone who didn't belong in these rough mountains. Behind him rode a man Marcus recognized with a surge of cold anger, William Mitchell, owner of the Mountain King mine, the man whose greed had murdered Elena and the boys. But it was the third horse that made Marcus's grip tighten on his rifle. A woman rode behind the second man, her arms wrapped around someone, a child. Even at this distance, Marcus could see the desperate way she held the small figure, the rigid set of her shoulders that spoke of fear barely held in check. As they drew closer, Marcus could make out more details. The woman was small and delicate, with auburn hair that caught what little light filtered through the snow clouds. Her dress was torn in places, muddy from hard travel, and she kept glancing back down the trail as if expecting pursuit. The child in her arms appeared to be a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, her small face pressed against her mother's shoulder. The lead rider called a halt just within the clearing that surrounded Marcus's cabin, his pale eyes scanning the seemingly empty homestead. When he spoke, his voice carried the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Henderson," he called out. "Marcus Henderson. I know you're up here. Come out and let's discuss this like civilized men. Marcus remained hidden, studying the group. The man in black had the soft look of someone who made his living with words rather than sweat, but the bulge under his coat suggested he carried iron. William Mitchell looked nervous, his eyes darting between the cabin and the tree line, one hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. But it was the woman who held Marcus's attention. She was whispering something to the child, soothing words that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her voice. "We know you're here, Henderson," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying a harder edge than his companion's. "We tracked you from Copper Creek. You can't hide up here forever." The woman suddenly straightened, her green eyes scanning the clearing with the sharp intelligence of someone who recognized danger. When her gaze passed over Marcus's hiding spot, he could have sworn she looked directly at him, though he knew the pine's thick trunk concealed him completely. There was something in her expression, a silent plea that spoke louder than words. "Please," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the mountain air. "My daughter, she's cold and hungry. Whatever business you have with Mr. Henderson, surely it can wait until we've found shelter." The man in black turned to look at her, and even from his concealed position, Marcus could see the cold calculation in the stranger's pale eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, your concern for your daughter is touching, but Mr. Henderson's cooperation is essential to resolving this matter quickly. The longer he delays, the more difficult this becomes for everyone involved." Mrs. Mitchell, the woman was Sarah Mitchell, William's sister-in-law. Marcus had heard of her husband's death 3 weeks ago, a mining accident, they'd called it, though those with eyes to see and ears to hear knew better. James Mitchell had been asking questions about safety conditions, threatening to take his concerns to the territorial governor. Men who asked such questions in mining country had a tendency to meet with unfortunate accidents. "Enough games, Henderson." William Mitchell's voice rose with frustration. "I know you're listening. You want to know what happened to your family. What really happened in that mine. Mrs. Mitchell here has some very interesting documents that might shed light on that tragedy." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Elena and the boys had been visiting the mine that day, bringing lunch to the workers as they often did. The cave-in had been called an act of God, an unavoidable tragedy, but Marcus had always suspected there was more to it, had spent sleepless nights wondering if his family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Deaths could have been prevented. Sarah Mitchell's sharp intake of breath was audible even from Marcus's position. She hadn't known. Whatever documents she carried, she hadn't realized their connection to his personal tragedy. The knowledge seemed to drain what little color remained in her face. "You see, Henderson," the man in black continued, his tone almost conversational, "Mrs. Mitchell has come into possession of certain mining surveys and inspection reports that her late husband compiled, documents that in the wrong hands could cause considerable embarrassment to legitimate business interests. We're simply here to ensure these materials are returned to their proper owners." "They're not yours," Sarah said quietly, but her words carried across the clearing. "James died gathering this evidence. Good men have died because of what's in those reports." William Mitchell's hand moved closer to his gun. "Your husband was a troublemaker, Sarah. Just like his brother should have been more careful where he stuck his nose." The threat was clear, and Marcus saw Sarah's arms tighten protectively around her daughter. The little girl had raised her head now, dark eyes wide with confusion and fear as she sensed the tension in the adults around her. Marcus made his decision, moving with the fluid grace that had always surprised those who judged him by his size alone. He stepped out from behind the pine, rifle held at the ready but not directly threatening. The sudden appearance of his massive frame caused William Mitchell's horse to shy nervously, and the man in black reached instinctively for his weapon before thinking better of it. "That's far enough, gentlemen," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Mrs. Mitchell, ma'am, I believe you and your daughter could use some warm food and a safe place to rest." The relief that washed over Sarah's face was immediately replaced by alarm as she realized she might have traded one danger for another. She didn't know Marcus, had no reason to trust him beyond the fact that he was William Mitchell's enemy. But something in the gentle way he looked at her daughter, the careful distance he maintained to avoid frightening them, seemed to reassure her. "Henderson," the man in black said smoothly, "I'm Judge Clayton Morse. I'm here on official territorial business, investigating certain irregularities in mining operations. Mrs. Mitchell is a key witness, and I'm afraid I must insist she accompany me back to Copper Creek for questioning. Marcus studied the man who called himself a judge. He'd heard the name before: Clayton Morse, circuit judge who'd presided over several mining disputes, always ruling in favor of the companies. A man whose interpretation of the law seemed remarkably flexible when sufficient gold was involved. Funny thing about judges, Marcus said mildly, his rifle still held in a deceptively casual grip. Most of them I've known travel with proper legal documentation, writs, warrants, that sort of thing. You wouldn't happen to have any paperwork supporting this official business of yours, would you, Your Honor? Judge Morse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In cases involving territorial security, certain formalities can be dispensed with. I'm sure you understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Marcus replied. I understand that Mrs. Mitchell looks like she's been riding hard for days, fleeing from something or someone. I understand that bringing a child into these mountains with winter coming takes the kind of desperation that comes from mortal fear. And I understand that men who conduct legitimate legal business don't usually require armed escorts. William Mitchell's patience snapped. Enough of this, Sarah. You're coming with us now. You've caused enough trouble with your meddling in things that don't concern you. Everything that happened in that mine concerns me, Sarah said, finding her voice. James died because he tried to protect the workers. Good men are dead because you cut corners and ignored safety warnings. Your husband died because he couldn't mind his own business, Mitchell snarled. Just like those Mexican twins and their mother. Should have stayed away from places they didn't belong. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Elena and the boys. Mitchell was talking about Elena and the boys. The casual callousness with which the man dismissed their deaths ignited a rage in Marcus that he'd kept carefully banked for 3 years. Mr. Mitchell, Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet, I think you should leave my mountain now, before I do something we'll both regret. Judge Morse raised a hand, recognizing the shift in Marcus's demeanor. Now see here, Henderson, threatening a territorial judge is a serious offense. I could have you arrested for interfering with official business. Then arrest me, Marcus said simply. But Mrs. Mitchell and her daughter stay here until they're ready to leave of their own free will. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 armed men against 1, but Marcus held the advantage of position and local knowledge. Judge Morse seemed to be calculating odds, weighing the benefits of forcing the issue against the risks of challenging a man of Marcus's obvious capabilities on his own ground. It was William Mitchell who broke first, his hand dropping to his gun with a curse, but Marcus was already moving, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides before Mitchell could clear leather. A massive hand closed over the smaller man's wrist, and the sound of bones grinding together was audible in the sudden silence. I wouldn't, Marcus said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Your friend the judge might have federal connections, but you're just a man who profits from other men's deaths. Killing you would be a public service. Mitchell's face had gone white with pain, but he managed to gasp out, you can't protect her forever. She's got something that belongs to us. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you murdered her husband, Marcus replied, releasing Mitchell's wrist with a slight push that sent the man stumbling backward. Judge Morse's horse danced nervously as he fought to control both the animal and the situation. This isn't over, Henderson. Mrs. Mitchell has evidence of serious crimes. The territorial government will not allow such materials to remain in the hands of civilians. The territorial government is welcome to request those materials through proper legal channels, Marcus said, with proper warrants, signed by proper authorities, conducted through proper procedures. Until then, Mrs. Mitchell is my guest. Sarah, who had watched this exchange with growing amazement, finally found her voice. Mr. Henderson, I don't want to bring trouble to your home. These men, they've been chasing us for 3 days. They have others with them. Marcus turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the gentleness in his dark eyes. Despite his intimidating size and the casual way he'd handled William Mitchell, there was something profoundly peaceful about this mountain giant. Ma'am, he said quietly, trouble found my home 3 years ago when good people died for the sake of mining company profits. These men represent that same evil. You're welcome here for as long as you need sanctuary. Judge Morse gathered his reins, recognizing that the immediate confrontation was lost. You're making a serious mistake, Henderson. Mitchell's husband was involved in activities that bordered on treason. The documents she carries could compromise territorial security. Then I'm sure a proper court will sort that out, Marcus replied. When you come back with proper authority and proper procedures, we'll be back, William Mitchell snarled, cradling his injured wrist. With enough men to drag her down off this mountain, you're welcome to try, Marcus said mildly. But you might want to consider that winter's coming early this year. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and I know every trail, every cave, every place a man might shelter or hide. You bring trouble to my mountain, and you might find you don't leave it. The threat was delivered with such matter-of-fact calm that it carried more weight than any shouted challenge. Judge Morse seemed to recognize this, tugging at his reins to turn his horse back toward the trail. Until we meet again, Henderson, he said. Mrs. Mitchell. They watched the three riders disappear back down the switchback trail, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the whisper of falling snow. Only when they were completely gone did Marcus lower his rifle and turn his full attention to the woman and child, who had just become his responsibility. Sarah Mitchell sat perfectly still on her horse, studying this gentle giant who had just risked everything to protect two strangers. Her daughter Emma had raised her head to look at Marcus with the frank curiosity of childhood, unafraid now that the angry men were gone. Ma'am, Marcus said softly, you and your little one look like you could use some warm food and a safe place to rest. Would you honor me with your company for supper? The formal courtesy of the invitation delivered by a man who could have simply commanded their obedience, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had treated her with such gentle respect. Henderson, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I'm afraid I don't have anything to offer in return for your kindness. Marcus stepped forward to help her down from the horse, his movements careful and respectful. Ma'am, you've already given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Sarah asked, settling Emma on her hip as her feet touched solid ground. Marcus looked down at the little girl, who was regarding him with solemn dark eyes, then back at Sarah. A reason to believe that good still exists in this world, and that some things are worth fighting for. As he led them toward the warm glow of his cabin, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death. For the first time in weeks she felt safe. She had no way of knowing that this moment of sanctuary was about to transform into something far more dangerous and far more beautiful than either of them could imagine. The mountain giant who had just promised them protection was about to make a vow that would change the course of their lives forever. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of more riders echoed through the valley. Judge Morse and William Mitchell had not come alone, and they would not give up easily. But for now, in this moment, Sarah Mitchell and her daughter had found refuge with a man whose gentle heart beat inside a frame capable of moving mountains. The real story was just beginning. The warmth that greeted Sarah and Emma as they crossed the threshold of Marcus's cabin was more than just the heat from the stone fireplace. The interior spoke of a man who valued function over form, but who took care with the details that mattered. Hand-hewn furniture bore the marks of careful craftsmanship, while shelves lined with books suggested an educated mind behind the mountain man's rugged exterior. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom, and what appeared to be a small workshop area where Marcus could work on repairs during the harsh mountain winters. Emma's eyes went wide as she took in the cozy interior, her small hand reaching out to touch the carved horse that sat on a low table near the fireplace. The toy was exquisitely detailed, each muscle and flowing mane rendered with an artist's precision. Marcus noticed her fascination and knelt down to her level, his massive frame folding with surprising grace. That's Thunder, he said softly, his deep voice gentle enough not to startle the child. He's been waiting for someone to play with him. Would you like to hold him? Emma looked up at her mother for permission, receiving an encouraging nod before carefully taking the wooden horse in her small hands. The craftsmanship was remarkable, the wood worn smooth by years of handling, suggesting this had been a treasured possession rather than a mere decoration. Did you make him? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I did, Marcus replied, settling onto the floor beside her with easy familiarity. I made him for my boys Miguel and Gabriel. They would have been about your age now. Sarah felt her heart clench at the past tense, understanding immediately that tragedy lay behind those simple words. She watched as Marcus showed Emma how Thunder's legs moved, how his head could nod, speaking to the child with infinite patience while his eyes held depths of sorrow that only another parent could truly comprehend. "Where are your boys now?" Emma asked with the direct honesty of childhood, unaware of the pain her innocent question might cause. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his large hand stilling on the wooden toy. "They're with the angels now, little one. They went to sleep in the mountain one day, and never woke up." Sarah saw the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the careful control he maintained over emotions that could easily overwhelm. She recognized the signs of a grief carefully managed but never fully healed. It was a pain she knew intimately, though her loss was measured in weeks rather than years. "Mama says Papa is with the angels too," Emma said matter-of-factly, then looked up at Marcus with the solemn wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who had been touched by loss. "Do you think they play together?" The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. For just a moment, the careful barriers he maintained softened, revealing a vulnerability that made her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I think they might," Marcus said after a moment, his voice rougher than before. "I think your papa and my boys would get along just fine." Emma nodded seriously, then held Thunder out to Marcus. "Maybe Thunder misses them. He looks lonely." Marcus accepted the wooden horse, turning it over in his hands as if seeing it for the first time in years. "Maybe he does," he agreed quietly, "but maybe having you here to play with him will help." While this gentle exchange unfolded, Sarah took the opportunity to study their unexpected protector more closely. Everything about the cabin spoke of a man who lived deliberately, who chose each item for purpose rather than decoration. The books on his shelves ranged from practical texts on farming and animal husbandry, to volumes of poetry and philosophy. A guitar sat in one corner, its strings well maintained, and the wood polished with care. Medical supplies occupied a prominent shelf, suggesting someone who had learned to tend wounds and illnesses in a place where professional help was days away. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to intrude but needing to understand the man who had just offered them sanctuary. "Those men who were here, they seemed to know you. Have you had dealings with them before?" Marcus helped Emma settle on a thick rug before the fireplace, ensuring she was comfortable before turning his attention to Sarah. When he looked at her directly, she was struck again by the gentleness in his dark eyes, so at odds with his intimidating physical presence. "William Mitchell owns the mine where my family died," he said simply. "I've been trying to prove that the cave-in wasn't an accident for 3 years. Judge Morse presided over the inquest that ruled it an act of God." The pieces began falling into place for Sarah, the documents James compiled, the mining surveys and safety reports he was gathering. "You think they might contain evidence about what happened to your family?" "I think your husband stumbled onto something much bigger than safety violations," Marcus replied, moving to the fireplace to stoke the flames higher. "The Mountain King mine has had more accidents in the past 5 years than any other operation in the territory. Men who ask questions tend to meet with unfortunate ends." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. James was asking questions. He'd been corresponding with territorial mining inspectors, gathering reports from other sites. He said he'd found evidence of a pattern, that someone was systematically covering up safety violations to protect profits. "And now he's dead, and you're running for your life with documents that powerful men want destroyed," Marcus observed, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "The question is, what do we do about it?" The use of "we" was not lost on Sarah. This man, who owed her nothing, had already appointed himself as her protector. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. She didn't want to bring more tragedy into his life, didn't want his kindness to cost him the peace he'd found in these mountains. "Mr. Henderson, I can't ask you to risk yourself for us," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized how desperately she hoped he would ignore them. "You've already done more than enough by giving us shelter. If you could just help us get to Fort Collins, I have contacts there who might be able to help." Marcus turned from the fireplace, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her heart. "Mrs. Mitchell, when was the last time you felt safe, really safe, not just temporarily out of immediate danger but truly secure. The question caught her off guard. Sarah found herself thinking back, trying to remember a time when fear hadn't been her constant companion. Before James's death, certainly, but even then there had been the growing tension as he'd become more involved in investigating the mines, the late-night conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the worried looks he'd given Emma when he thought no one was watching. "I don't remember," she admitted quietly. "Even before James died, things had been difficult." "Then let me make you a promise," Marcus said, moving closer but stopping a respectful distance away. "You and Emma are under my protection now. No one will harm you while I draw breath." The simple declaration, delivered with quiet conviction, hit Sarah with unexpected force. She had been independent her entire adult life, first as a school teacher supporting herself, then as a wife who managed household finances, and helped her husband with his business correspondence. The idea of relying completely on someone else's protection went against every instinct she had developed. And yet, looking at this gentle giant who had already risked confrontation with armed men for the sake of two strangers, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not just the desperate hope of survival, but the deeper hope that perhaps there were still good people in the world, still men who would stand against injustice without thought of personal gain. "Why?" she asked, the single word containing all her confusion and gratitude. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to Emma, who had fallen asleep on the rug with Thunder clutched in her small arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and new determination. 3 years ago, I failed to protect the people I loved most in this world. I was away on a cattle drive when the mine collapsed, earning money to buy land so we could build a proper ranch. I chose profit over presence, and my family paid the price." Sarah felt her throat tighten at the raw honesty in his words. She recognized the guilt that haunted him, the endless replay of choices made and chances missed. It was a burden she carried herself, wondering if there had been something she could have done to prevent James's death, some warning she could have given that might have saved him. "Their deaths weren't your fault," she said softly. "You couldn't have known what would happen." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but I can know what's happening now. I can see a woman and child who need protection, and I can choose to provide it. I can't bring back Elena and the boys, but I can make sure you and Emma don't become more victims of the same evil that took them." The mention of his wife's name was like a key turning in a lock, revealing another layer of this complex man. Elena. The name spoke of love lost, of dreams that had died in the darkness of a mine tunnel. Sarah found herself wondering what she had been like. This woman who had captured the heart of a gentle giant. "Tell me about her," Sarah said impulsively, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me." But Marcus didn't seem offended by the question. If anything, his expression softened as he settled into the chair across from her, his eyes losing focus as he looked backward through time. "Elena was like sunshine in human form," he said slowly, as if the words were precious things that needed careful handling. "She had this laugh that could make even the grumpiest old prospector smile. She taught school in Copper Creek before we married, and even after, she would help the miners' children with their letters when she could." Sarah felt a strange kinship with this woman she would never meet. A school teacher like herself, someone who had seen education as a way to lift people up, to give them opportunities beyond the dangerous work that trapped so many in mining country. "The boys were just like her," Marcus continued, his voice growing softer, "always laughing, always getting into mischief. Miguel was 10 minutes older than Gabriel, and he never let his brother forget it. Gabriel was the dreamer, always building elaborate castles in the dirt and telling stories about knights and dragons. Miguel was the practical one, following me around, wanting to learn how to fix things, how to make things work." The pain in his voice was palpable, and Sarah found herself blinking back tears. She could picture it all so clearly, the happy family, the father teaching his sons, the mother bringing light and laughter to their mountain home. It made the loss even more tragic, the deliberate nature of their deaths even more cruel. They visited the mine that day because Elena wanted to check on Maria Santos, whose husband had been injured in a smaller cave in the week before. Marcus said, his hands clenching slightly in his lap. "She always did that, always looked after people who were hurting." The boys loved going with her, loved feeling like they were helping. "They sound wonderful," Sarah said quietly. "All of them. They were," Marcus agreed. "And when I think about them now, I try to remember the laughter instead of the loss. I try to imagine what Elena would say if she knew I'd spent 3 years hiding in these mountains, nursing my grief instead of fighting for justice." Sarah suspected she knew exactly what Elena would have said. Any woman who chose to teach children and care for injured minors would not have wanted her husband to withdraw from the world. She would have wanted him to channel his pain into purpose, his grief into action that might prevent other families from suffering the same loss. "She would want you to help us," Sarah said with sudden certainty. "She would want you to make sure that what happened to your family doesn't happen to others." "I know," Marcus said simply. "That's why you're going to stay here until we can figure out a way to get those documents to someone who can act on them. And that's why I'm going to make sure you and Emma not only survive this, but find a way to build a life worth living on the other side of it." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with cold or fear. There was something almost prophetic about the way he spoke, as if he could see a future that remained hidden from her. It was both thrilling and terrifying to be the focus of such determination. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow against the cabin's windows with increasing force. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving in earnest, and Sarah realized with a mixture of relief and concern that they would be trapped here for at least the night, possibly longer. "The storm will cover our tracks," Marcus observed, seemingly reading her thoughts. "Anyone trying to follow us will have to wait until it passes. That gives us time to plan our next move." "What do you think they'll do?" Sarah asked. "Judge Morse and William Mitchell, I mean. Will they really come back with more men?" Marcus's expression grew grim. "They'll be back. The question is when and with how many. Judge Morse has federal connections, which means he can call in marshals if he wants to make this official. William Mitchell has money, which means he can hire private men who don't worry too much about legal niceties." The thought of armed men hunting them through the mountains was terrifying, but Sarah found that her fear was tempered by an unexpected sense of security. Looking at Marcus, seeing the quiet competence with which he moved through his domain, she believed him capable of protecting them against whatever came. It was an unfamiliar feeling for a woman who had learned to rely primarily on herself. "There's something else," she said, remembering the sewing kit that held James's most damning evidence. "The documents they want, they're not just mining reports." James discovered that the safety violations were being covered up all the way to the territorial level. He found evidence that territorial mining inspectors were being bribed to falsify reports, that federal safety standards were being ignored systematically across multiple sites. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious accusation. The kind that could bring down government officials if it's true." "It's true," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "James wouldn't have risked his life, wouldn't have put Emma and me in danger, unless he was absolutely certain. He spent months verifying everything, cross-referencing reports, building an airtight case." "Then we're not just dealing with local corruption," Marcus mused. "We're looking at territorial-level conspiracy, possibly reaching all the way to Washington. No wonder they're willing to kill to keep those documents from seeing daylight." The magnitude of what they faced was sobering, but rather than discouraging Marcus, it seemed to strengthen his resolve. Sarah watched as his expression shifted from concern to determination, as if he were accepting a challenge that had been placed before him. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah began, but he held up a gentle hand. "Marcus," he said, "if we're going to be fighting this battle together, you might as well call me Marcus." The simple offer of his first name felt significant, a small but meaningful step toward the kind of trust that would be essential if they were going to survive what lay ahead. Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in weeks, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her tired face. "Then you should call me Sarah," she replied. "And thank you, Marcus, for everything." He nodded, then rose to check the cabin's defenses one more time. As he moved around the room, securing shutters and checking the bar across the door, Sarah noticed the way he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life working with his body. Despite his size, there was nothing clumsy or awkward about him. Every motion was purposeful, efficient, the product of years spent in dangerous country where survival often depended on being alert and prepared. "The storm should blow through by morning," Marcus said as he completed his circuit of the cabin. "We'll have a day, maybe two, before anyone can navigate the trails safely. That's time enough to decide our next move." Sarah looked down at Emma, still sleeping peacefully on the rug, clutching the wooden horse that had belonged to Marcus's lost sons. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude for their temporary safety, fear for what lay ahead, and something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what you said about protecting us, about making sure we survive this, you really meant it, didn't you?" He turned to look at her, and in his dark eyes she saw not just determination but something deeper, a commitment that went beyond mere gallantry or a sense of duty. This was personal for him now, tied up with his own need for redemption, his own quest to make meaning from loss. "I meant every word," he said simply. "You and Emma are my family now, for as long as you'll have me. I'll see you both safe whatever it takes." The promise hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to explore. But as the storm raged outside and the firelight danced across the walls of the cabin, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before James's death. She felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was part of something larger than just survival. Outside the wind howled through the mountains, but inside the cabin, three people who had been brought together by tragedy were beginning to discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unexpected places. The battle ahead would test them all, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. Part 3. Sanctuary. In the storm, dawn broke gray and muffled, the world outside transformed into a crystalline wilderness where snow had erased all familiar landmarks. Marcus was already awake when the first pale light filtered through the cabin's shuttered windows, his internal clock calibrated to mountain rhythms that had little to do with clocks or calendars. He had slept fitfully in the chair by the fireplace, one ear always listening for sounds that didn't belong to the storm's natural symphony. Sarah stirred as the scent of coffee and bacon reached her, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory came flooding back. She was lying on Marcus's bed, still fully clothed except for her muddy boots, which someone had carefully removed and set by the fireplace to dry. Emma was curled beside her, small hands still clutching the wooden horse named Thunder, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. "Good morning," Marcus said softly, not wanting to startle them. He stood at the stove, somehow managing to look perfectly at home despite his massive frame in the compact kitchen area. "I hope you don't mind that I moved you both to the bed. The floor gets cold, even with the fire going." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment at having slept so deeply in a stranger's home, but also a profound sense of gratitude. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat, listening for sounds of pursuit or danger. The simple act of feeling safe enough to truly rest was a gift she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "Thank you," she said, carefully extricating herself from Emma's sleeping embrace. "I didn't mean to impose on your bed." "No imposition," Marcus replied, his attention focused on the cast-iron skillet where bacon sizzled and popped. "I sleep in the chair more often than not these days. Old habits from the cattle drives." Sarah moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the transformed landscape outside. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, accumulating to a depth that would make travel treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with mountain conditions. Trees bowed under the weight of their white burden, and the narrow trail that had brought Judge Morse and William Mitchell to the cabin was now completely obscured. "How much snow?" she asked, both hoping for and dreading the answer. 2 feet, maybe more in the drifts," Marcus said, cracking eggs into the skillet with surprising delicacy for such large hands. "The main trail down to the valley will be impassable for at least 2 days, longer if the wind keeps drifting it." The news was simultaneously relief and concern. Relief because it meant their pursuers couldn't reach them immediately, concern because it also meant they were truly trapped, dependent entirely on Marcus's goodwill and competence for their survival. Sarah found herself studying this man who had become their protector, noting the quiet confidence with which he moved through his domain. Emma began to stir, small sounds of waking that brought a smile to Marcus's face. There was something almost paternal in his expression as he watched the little girl emerge from sleep, Thunder still held protectively in her arms. "Good morning, little one," he said gently. "How did you sleep?" Emma sat up, her hair sticking up in every direction, and looked around the cabin with wide, curious eyes. In the morning light she seemed less overwhelmed by their situation, more ready to explore this new environment that offered warmth and safety. "I dreamed about horses," she announced solemnly. "Big ones, like thunder, but real. They were running in the snow." "Wild horses sometimes come through this valley," Marcus told her, his voice taking on the special tone adults used with children when sharing something magical. "Maybe this spring, when the snow melts, we'll see them together." The casual assumption that they would still be here in spring sent an unexpected shiver through Sarah. She hadn't thought beyond immediate survival, hadn't dared to imagine a future that extended beyond escaping their current danger. But Marcus spoke as if their presence in his life was already an established fact, as if the question wasn't whether they would stay, but how they would all fit together. "Can I help make breakfast?" Emma asked, sliding off the bed and padding over to where Marcus worked at the stove. "I'd be honored to have your help," Marcus said seriously, lifting her onto a wooden stool that brought her to counter height. "Can you stir these eggs while I slice the bread?" Sarah watched this domestic scene with a mixture of wonder and sadness. Emma had taken to Marcus with the natural trust of childhood, accepting his gentle presence without the wariness that Sarah herself still felt. It occurred to her that her daughter had been starved for male attention since James's death, that she had unconsciously been seeking the kind of stable protective presence that Marcus offered so naturally. "You're good with children," Sarah observed, moving to help with the meal preparation. Marcus's hand stilled momentarily on the bread he was slicing. "Elena always said I was meant to be a father," he said quietly. "She used to tease that I was too gentle to be a proper cowboy, that I should have been a school teacher instead." The mention of his deceased wife brought a moment of awkward silence, but Emma, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, filled it with her own observations. "My papa used to make eggs like this," she said, concentrating fiercely on her stirring, "but he put cheese in them." "Do you have cheese, Mr. Marcus?" "I do indeed," Marcus replied, reaching for a wrapped block on a high shelf. "And please just call me Marcus. Mr. Marcus makes me sound like somebody's grandfather." Emma giggled at this, the sound bright and pure in the cozy cabin. It was the first time Sarah had heard her daughter laugh since James's death, and the sound hit her with unexpected force. She had been so focused on survival, on keeping them both alive and ahead of their pursuers, that she had forgotten how much they had both lost. Not just James, but the simple joys of normal life, the safety that allowed children to laugh without fear. As they worked together to prepare breakfast, Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't thought possible. The simple domestic routine of cooking and eating together felt almost normal, a brief respite from the constant tension of the past weeks. Marcus moved around them with easy grace, including them naturally in his morning routine while maintaining the respectful distance that spoke of good manners and careful consideration. When they finally sat down to eat, the cabin filled with the comfortable sounds of shared meal. Emma chattered about everything and nothing, her natural exuberance returning as she felt safe enough to lower the guard she had learned to maintain. Marcus listened to her stories with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention to her childish concerns and observations. "Emma," Sarah said gently when her daughter paused for breath, "eat your eggs before they get cold." "Yes, Mama," Emma replied obediently, then looked up at Marcus with curious eyes. "Marcus, why do you live up here all by yourself? Don't you get lonely?" The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard, and Sarah saw him struggle for an answer that would be honest without being frightening to a young child. "I do get lonely sometimes," he admitted, "but I have the animals for company, and books to read and projects to work on. And now I have you and your mama visiting, which makes everything much less lonely." "Are we going to stay here forever?" Emma asked, the question that Sarah herself had been afraid to voice. Marcus looked across the table at Sarah, his dark eyes asking permission before he answered. She found herself nodding slightly, curious to hear how he would handle such a complex question. "That depends on a lot of things," Marcus said carefully. "Your mama and I need to make sure it's safe for you to travel, and we need to figure out the best place for you both to go. But I want you to know that you're welcome here for as long as you need to stay." Emma considered this with the seriousness that children brought to important matters. "I think I'd like to stay," she announced finally. "I like it here. It's cozy, and you're nice, and Thunder needs someone to play with." Sarah felt her throat tighten at her daughter's simple acceptance of their situation. Children adapted so much more easily than adults, accepting changes that would terrify their parents with remarkable resilience. "We'll see, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "There are some things Mama needs to take care of first." After breakfast, while Emma played with Thunder near the fireplace, Sarah and Marcus sat at the table to discuss their situation more seriously. The events of the previous day felt almost dreamlike in the morning light, but the reality of their danger hadn't diminished with the dawn. "I've been thinking about what you said," Marcus began, his voice low enough not to carry to Emma's corner, "about the territorial level corruption, The evidence your husband gathered, if it's as extensive as you believe, we can't trust local authorities to handle it properly. Sarah nodded, having reached the same conclusion during her sleepless hours. James was planning to take everything to the federal authorities in Denver, or even Washington if necessary. He said the corruption went too high in the territorial government to trust anyone local. Denver's a long way from here, Marcus observed, especially with winter coming and people hunting us, but there might be another option. He rose from the table and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, returning with a small collection of letters tied with string. Sarah watched as he sorted through them, finally selecting one that bore an official-looking seal. Colonel Robert Hayes, United States Army Corps of Engineers, Marcus said, showing her the letter. He's my brother stationed at Fort Collins. He's been investigating irregularities in territorial mining operations for the federal government. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A federal investigation? Into the mines? Into the whole system, Marcus confirmed. Robert wrote to me 6 months ago, asking if I knew anything about safety violations or cover-ups at the Mountain King mine. I didn't respond because I didn't have proof, just suspicions and grief. The implications were staggering. If Marcus's brother was already investigating the corruption that James had died trying to expose, then the documents Sarah carried might be exactly what the federal government needed to build a case. Why didn't you mention this yesterday? Sarah asked. Though she kept her voice free of accusation, she understood that trust took time to build, especially for a man who had been betrayed by the system he had once served. Because I needed to be sure about you, Marcus said honestly. Robert warned me that the corruption might reach into federal circles as well, that there were people in Washington with financial interests in keeping the territorial mining operations running without oversight. I had to know that you weren't part of some elaborate deception. Sarah felt a chill at the thought that their danger might extend even to federal levels. And now you're sure? Marcus looked across the cabin to where Emma sat, completely absorbed in creating an elaborate adventure for Thunder involving imaginary mountains and valleys marked out on the rug. Now I'm sure, he said simply. No one would use a child as part of such a deception, and no one could fake the kind of grief I see in your eyes when you talk about your husband. The simple statement of trust meant more to Sarah than any elaborate declaration. This man, who had every reason to be suspicious and guarded, had chosen to believe in her. The knowledge was both humbling and empowering. So what do we do? She asked. How do we get the documents to your brother? Marcus studied the letter in his hands, his expression thoughtful. Fort Collins is 5 days hard riding from here under good conditions. With the snow and people hunting us, it could take twice that long. But Robert has connections throughout the territory, including some in Copper Creek who could be trusted to help us. You're talking about leaving here, Sarah said, and she was surprised by the reluctance she heard in her own voice. Despite the circumstances that had brought them to this mountain sanctuary, she found herself oddly reluctant to leave its safety. Not immediately, Marcus said. The storm gives us time to plan properly, to make sure we have everything we need for the journey, and there are preparations I need to make here, things to secure before we leave. Sarah noticed his assumption that he would be coming with them, and found herself both grateful and concerned. Marcus, I can't ask you to abandon your home for us. You've already risked enough. This isn't my home anymore, Marcus said quietly, his gaze moving around the cabin with something that might have been sadness. It's been my hiding place, my refuge from the world. But Elena and the boys, they wouldn't want me to hide forever. They'd want me to live, to fight for things that matter. The conviction in his voice sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with cold. There was something transformative happening to this gentle giant, something that went beyond simple protectiveness or duty. She was witnessing a man awakening from years of grief-induced hibernation, remembering who he had been before tragedy changed everything. What about after? She asked. After we deliver the documents, after the investigation, what then? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he had been thinking about this question for hours. I've been alone for 3 years, he said finally. I thought that was all there was left for me, that I was meant to live with my ghosts and my guilt until the mountain claimed me too. But watching you with Emma, seeing the strength it takes to protect someone you love, it reminds me that there are still things worth fighting for. Sarah felt her breath catch at the implications in his words. There was something building between them, something that went beyond gratitude or shared danger. It frightened her almost as much as Judge Morse and his hired guns, because it represented a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "Marcus," she began, but he held up a gentle hand. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said softly. "I'm just saying that when this is over, when you and Emma are safe, I'd like the chance to see what kind of life we might build together, if you'll have me." The offer hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah found herself looking at Emma, playing contentedly in a pool of sunlight by the fireplace, and trying to imagine a future that included this gentle giant who had already shown them both such kindness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin something new was taking root, something that might grow into the kind of love that could heal old wounds and create new possibilities. The storm that had trapped them together was also giving them time to discover that sometimes the most unexpected refuges could become the most cherished homes. Part 4. Bonds in the Blizzard. The second day of the storm dawned with no sign of the weather breaking. If anything, the wind had intensified during the night, driving the snow into sculpted drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's windows. Marcus stood at the door, studying the transformed landscape with the practiced eye of someone who had weathered many mountain winters. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, joining him at the small gap he had opened to assess their situation. "Bad enough that no one will be traveling for at least another day," Marcus replied, closing the door against the bitter wind. "The temperature dropped overnight. Even if the snow stops, it'll take time for the trails to become passable again." Emma looked up from where she was carefully feeding Thunder small pieces of biscuit from breakfast. "Are we snowed in, like in the stories?" "We are indeed, little one," Marcus said, settling beside her on the rug. "But that just means we have more time to get to know each other. Would you like to hear about the time Thunder and his friends rescued a lost deer from a blizzard?" As Marcus launched into an elaborate tale involving the wooden horse and various other hand-carved animals that emerged from a box beneath his bed, Sarah found herself studying the easy way he interacted with her daughter. There was nothing forced or awkward about his attention to Emma. It seemed as natural as breathing, as if he had simply been waiting for the right child to share his stories with. The domesticity of their situation was both comforting and surreal. Here they were, trapped in a mountain cabin while dangerous men hunted them, and yet Sarah found herself experiencing moments of peace she hadn't felt in months. There was something about Marcus's steady presence that made even their precarious situation feel manageable. "Sarah," Marcus said during a lull in Emma's questions about the story, "I've been thinking about the documents you're carrying. Would you be comfortable showing them to me? If I'm going to help you get them to my brother, I should know exactly what we're dealing with." Sarah hesitated, not from lack of trust, but from habit. She had guarded James's evidence so carefully for so long that sharing it felt like a betrayal of his memory. But looking at Marcus, seeing the genuine concern in his dark eyes, she realized that keeping secrets from the man who was risking everything to protect them made no sense. "Of course," she said, moving to retrieve her leather satchel from where it sat beside the bed. "But I should warn you, some of what James discovered is disturbing." Marcus nodded gravely as Sarah retrieved her satchel, his expression indicating that he understood the weight of what she was about to share. Emma, sensing the shift in the adult's mood, quietly gathered Thunder and the other wooden animals into a small circle, creating her own little world, while the grown-ups discussed serious matters. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the leather bag that had become both her burden and her lifeline. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were the documents that James had died trying to protect: mining surveys, safety inspection reports, correspondence between territorial officials, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger showing payments made to silence inspectors and cover up dangerous conditions. "James spent months gathering all of this," Sarah said softly, unwrapping the first bundle. "He started with just questions about safety conditions at the Mountain King mine, but the more he investigated, the bigger the conspiracy became." Marcus accepted the first document, a mining survey dated 6 months before the cave-in that had killed his family. His large hands handled the paper with surprising delicacy, and Sarah watched his face grow increasingly grim as he read. The survey clearly showed structural weaknesses in the mine's support system, along with recommendations for immediate repairs that had apparently been ignored. "This report was filed 3 weeks before the cave-in," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. It specifically warns that the main tunnel was at risk of collapse. The correspondents dismissed the engineers' concerns as overly cautious and authorized continued operation without the recommended safety measures. Marcus read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word. Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composure. Process the confirmation that his family's deaths had been not just preventable, but specifically caused by willful negligence. "There's more," Sarah said gently, producing another bundle of documents. James found evidence that this pattern was repeated at mines throughout the territory, officials taking bribes to overlook safety violations, engineers being pressured to alter their reports, families being paid to keep quiet about accidents that were actually murders. The next set of documents painted an even more damning picture. A ledger in James's careful handwriting detailed payments made to territorial officials, with amounts that corresponded to dates when critical safety reports had been altered or suppressed. Names that Sarah recognized from newspaper articles and political announcements were listed alongside dollar amounts that represented the price of human lives. "Judge Morse," Marcus said, pointing to an entry that showed regular payments to the man who had presided over the inquest into his family's deaths. He received $500 the week before he ruled the cave-in an act of God. James traced the money back to a consortium of mining interests. Sarah explained. It wasn't just William Mitchell's operation. There were investors from back east, territorial officials, even some federal representatives who had financial stakes in keeping the mines operating without proper oversight. Marcus set down the documents and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling snow as if trying to process the magnitude of what he had just learned. Sarah watched him struggle with the revelation that his family's deaths were part of a larger conspiracy, that their loss was one thread in a web of corruption that stretched far beyond a single mine or a single moment of corporate greed. "How many?" he asked quietly, his back still turned to her. "How many what? How many families like mine? How many deaths that could have been prevented?" Sarah consulted the ledger, though she already knew the numbers by heart. James documented 47 deaths over the past 3 years that he could directly link to covered-up safety violations. But he thought the actual number was much higher, because many incidents were never properly investigated. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of all those lost lives, all those families destroyed by greed and corruption. Emma looked up from her toys, sensing the sadness in the room, and quietly moved to stand beside Marcus at the window. "Are you sad?" she asked with the direct honesty of childhood. Marcus looked down at her, and Sarah saw him visibly pull himself together, forcing his emotions back under control for the sake of the child who was looking up at him with such trust. "I am sad," he admitted, "but I'm also grateful that your mama and papa worked so hard to gather this evidence. It means that maybe we can stop bad things from happening to other families." Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by taking Marcus's large hand in her small one. "Mama says that when we're sad we should remember the good things." "What good things do you remember?" The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard, and Sarah watched as his expression softened. For a moment she glimpsed the man he had been before grief and guilt had driven him into the mountains, the gentle soul that Elena and his sons had known and loved. "I remember teaching Miguel and Gabriel to carve wood," he said slowly. "Miguel was so careful, so precise with every cut. Gabriel would get impatient and try to rush, but he had an artist's eye for shape and flow. I remember Elena singing while she cooked, how she could make even the simplest meal taste like a feast, because she put love into every ingredient." "Those are good memories," Emma said seriously. "You should keep those." "I will," Marcus promised, squeezing her hand gently, "and I'll remember today too, when a very wise little girl reminded me to look for the good things even when everything seems dark." Sarah felt her throat tighten at the exchange, moved by her daughter's innocent wisdom, and Marcus's willingness to be comforted by a child's simple truth. There was something profoundly healing about watching these two comfort each other, as if they were both exactly what the other needed. "There's something else," Sarah said, reluctantly drawing their attention back to the documents. "James found evidence that the corruption extends beyond just mining safety. There are records of election fraud, illegal land seizures, even murder contracts for people who asked too many questions." She produced a final bundle, this one wrapped in multiple layers of protective cloth. Inside was a small notebook in James's handwriting, filled with names, dates, and circumstances surrounding the deaths of people who had opposed the mining consortium's interests. "Your husband was a brave man," Marcus said, accepting the notebook with reverence, "and a thorough one. This represents months of dangerous investigation." He knew the risks, Sarah replied, especially toward the end, when he realized how far the conspiracy reached. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would get this evidence to federal authorities who couldn't be bought. Marcus studied the notebook, occasionally asking Sarah to clarify a name or explain the context of a particular entry. As the full scope of James's investigation became clear, his expression grew increasingly determined. This wasn't just about justice for his own family anymore, it was about exposing a systematic pattern of corruption that had claimed dozens of lives and would claim more if left unchecked. "We have to get this to Robert," he said finally. "Not just for our families, but for everyone who died and everyone who might still die if these people aren't stopped." "The question is how," Sarah said. "Even after the storm passes we'll be hunted. Judge Morse has federal authority to requisition marshals, and William Mitchell has enough money to hire private guns. We can't just ride out of here and hope for the best." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities and obstacles. Sarah found herself studying his profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he considered problems before speaking. There was something deeply reassuring about his methodical approach to their dilemma. "There might be a way," he said finally, "but it would require trust and it would put us all at considerable risk." "What kind of way?" Sarah asked, though she was already prepared to follow wherever he led. The man who had shown them such kindness, who had treated her daughter with such gentle care, had earned the right to make decisions about their safety. "Dr. Samuel Wright in Copper Creek," Marcus said. "He was the physician who examined the victims of the mine collapse. He's also the one who signed the death certificates that Judge Morse used to rule the deaths accidental." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "You think he's part of the conspiracy?" "I think he's a good man who was pressured into falsifying medical reports," Marcus replied. "When I went to him after Elena and the boys died, asking questions about the cause of death, I could see the guilt in his eyes. He knew the truth, but he was afraid to speak it. And you think he would help us now?" "I think he's been carrying the weight of what he did for 3 years just like I've been carrying my guilt. Sometimes a man reaches a point where keeping silent becomes more unbearable than facing the consequences of speaking truth." The plan that Marcus outlined was risky but not impossible. Dr. Wright made regular trips to homesteads throughout the mountain valleys, tending to injuries and illnesses that couldn't wait for patients to travel to town. If they could intercept him during one of these visits, away from the watchful eyes in Copper Creek, they might be able to convince him to carry a message to Marcus's brother at Fort Collins. "It would mean leaving here," Sarah said, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind. Despite the danger that surrounded them, she had begun to think of this cabin as a sanctuary, a place where Emma could be a normal child, and she could feel safe for the first time in weeks. "Only temporarily," Marcus assured her, "and only if you're willing. I won't force this choice on you, Sarah. If you'd rather wait for spring, when the trails are clear and travel is easier, we can stay here through the winter." The offer was tempting almost beyond words. The thought of spending the long winter months in this cozy cabin, watching Emma play by the fireplace while Marcus carved new toys and told stories, painted a picture of peace that Sarah had never expected to experience again. But she knew it was an illusion, a temporary respite from a danger that would only grow more deadly with time. "They won't stop looking for us," she said. "Judge Morse and William Mitchell, they can't afford to let this evidence reach the right people. Even if they can't find us immediately, they'll keep trying." "That's true," Marcus agreed. "And every day we wait gives them more time to consolidate their power, to eliminate other potential witnesses, to build stronger defenses against the truth." Emma looked up from her toys, sensing the tension in their conversation. "Are we going on another adventure?" she asked. Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus, seeing her own concerns reflected in his dark eyes. "How did you explain to a 4-year-old that their safety required constant movement, constant vigilance, constant risk?" "We might be," Sarah said carefully. "How would you feel about that?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Will Marcus come with us?" "If you want me to," Marcus said gently. "I want you to," Emma announced with the certainty that only children possessed. "You tell the best stories, and you make Mama smile again." The innocent observation hit Sarah with unexpected force. She hadn't realized that her daughter had noticed the change in her demeanor, the way Marcus's presence had begun to ease the constant tension she had carried since James's death. It was both touching and slightly embarrassing to have her emotional state so accurately assessed by a 4-year-old. "Then it's settled," Marcus said, as if Emma's approval was the only authorization he needed. "We'll leave when the storm passes and the trails are safe enough for travel, but first we need to prepare properly." The rest of the day was spent in practical preparations. Marcus showed Sarah his cache of emergency supplies, dried foods that would travel well, medical supplies for treating injuries on the trail, extra ammunition for his rifles, and winter clothing that could mean the difference between life and death in mountain weather. "Elena's things," he said quietly when he produced a heavy wool coat and fur-lined boots that would fit Sarah. "She would want them to keep you warm." Sarah accepted the garments with a mixture of gratitude and awkwardness. Wearing a dead woman's clothes felt strange, but the practical necessity was undeniable. The dress she had fled in was inadequate for mountain travel, and proper winter gear could save her life. As evening approached and they gathered around the table for another shared meal, Sarah found herself studying this man who had so completely changed their circumstances. 3 days ago she had been a terrified fugitive with nowhere to turn, and no one to trust. Now she was part of an unlikely family, planning a dangerous mission with a man who had appointed himself as their protector. "Marcus," she said, during a quiet moment when Emma was occupied with her toys, "why did you really decide to help us? I know what you said about protection and justice, but there's something else, isn't there?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he gazed into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of carefully guarded emotions. "When Elena died, I thought I died too," he said simply. "I've been existing up here, not living, going through the motions of survival without any real purpose or hope. But when I saw you fighting to protect Emma, when I watched you face down armed men for the sake of your child, it reminded me what courage looks like, what love looks like in action." Sarah felt her breath catch at the raw honesty in his words. There was something happening between them that went beyond gratitude or shared danger, something that both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm not courageous," she protested. "I'm just desperate." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Marcus replied. "Sometimes love and desperation combine into something that looks exactly like heroism." Outside, the wind continued to howl through the mountains, but inside the cabin, 3 people who had been brought together by tragedy were discovering that sometimes the most unlikely combinations could create the strongest bonds. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but tonight they had each other, and that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. Part 4. The promise spoken the third morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with sunlight streaming through windows that had been dark for days. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crystalline world where every surface sparkled with frost and the silence was so complete it seemed to ring in their ears. Marcus stood on the cabin's small porch, breathing air so sharp it burned his lungs, studying the transformed landscape with the eye of a man who understood mountain weather. "The trails will be treacherous for another day," he announced as he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, "but by tomorrow afternoon, we should be able to move safely." Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension at the news. Part of her had hoped the storm would continue indefinitely, trapping them in this cozy sanctuary where Emma could play without fear and she could pretend that the outside world didn't exist. But she knew that safety was an illusion as long as Judge Morse and his allies remained free to pursue them. Emma looked up from where she was building an elaborate city for Thunder and his wooden companions, her small face bright with excitement. "Are we really going on an adventure tomorrow?" "We are," Marcus confirmed, settling beside her on the rug. "But first I have something very important to tell you and your mama." Sarah joined them on the floor, forming a small circle around Emma's toy city. There was something ceremonial about the moment, as if Marcus was preparing to make a declaration that would change everything between them. "Emma," Marcus began, his deep voice gentle but serious, "do you understand what it means when a man makes a promise?" Emma nodded solemnly. "It means he has to keep his word, no matter what." "That's exactly right," Marcus said, "and I want to make a promise to you and your mama, the most important promise I've ever made in my life." Sarah felt her heart begin to race as Marcus turned to look directly at her, his dark eyes holding depths of emotion she wasn't sure she was ready to navigate. "Sarah Mitchell," he said formally, as if they were standing before an altar instead of sitting on a cabin floor, "I promise you that by spring, when the snow melts and the valleys turn green again, you will carry my 3 sons." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, so unexpected and so loaded with meaning, that she could barely process them. Emma clapped her hands together in delight, apparently understanding the promise in her own childish way, but Sarah could only stare at Marcus in shock. "I don't understand," she whispered. Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and took her hands in his large gentle ones. "I'm saying that I want to marry you, Sarah. I want to make you my wife and Emma my daughter. I want us to be a family, not just for now while we run from danger but forever." The proposal was so far beyond anything Sarah had imagined that she felt dizzy. 3 days ago this man had been a stranger, now he was offering her a future she had never dared to dream of. "But the 3 sons," she said, her voice barely audible. "How can you promise something like that?" Marcus's smile was gentle and full of a confidence that seemed to come from someplace deeper than mere hope. "Because I believe in miracles, Sarah. I believe that God brought you and Emma to my mountain for a reason. I believe that sometimes the most broken people can help heal each other, and I believe that love, real love, can create new life even in the darkest circumstances." Sarah felt tears beginning to blur her vision as the full meaning of his words sank in. He wasn't just proposing marriage, he was offering her a complete transformation of her life, a chance to stop running, to stop hiding, to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. "You barely know me," she protested, though her heart was already singing with possibilities she was afraid to acknowledge. "I know enough," Marcus replied with quiet certainty. "I know you're brave enough to stand up to corrupt judges and armed men when your child is threatened. I know you're loyal enough to risk your life protecting evidence that could bring justice for people you've never met. I know you're gentle enough to comfort a grieving man without asking for anything in return." Emma had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention that children brought to adult conversations they sensed were important. Now she crawled closer to Marcus, looking up at him with serious dark eyes. "If you marry Mama, will you be my papa?" she asked. Marcus looked down at her, with an expression of such tenderness that Sarah felt her last defenses crumble. "I would be honored to be your papa, Emma, if that's what you want." "I want that very much," Emma said solemnly. "And I want baby brothers too. 3 of them, like you promised." The matter-of-fact way her daughter accepted this momentous change made Sarah realize how much Emma had been missing the stability of a complete family. Since James' death it had been just the 2 of them against the world, and while Sarah had tried to be everything her daughter needed, she couldn't be a father as well as a mother. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "I know this seems sudden. I know you need time to think, to process everything that's happened. But I need you to know that my offer isn't conditional on anything. Whether you say yes or no, I'll still protect you and Emma. I'll still help you get that evidence to my brother. Your safety doesn't depend on your answer to my proposal." The reassurance meant more to Sarah than Marcus could possibly know. Too often in her life, men's help had come with strings attached, with expectations and demands that made generosity feel like a transaction. To know that Marcus's protection was freely given, regardless of her response to his proposal, allowed her to consider his offer without the pressure of desperation. "Why 3 sons?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window where sunlight streamed across the snow-covered peaks. "Because I lost 2 sons when the mine collapsed," he said finally, "Miguel and Gabriel, and I think, maybe, they would want me to love new sons, not to replace them, but to honor their memory by creating new life, new hope." The explanation revealed so much about this complex man. He wasn't trying to recreate what he had lost, but to build something new from the foundation of his experience with love and loss. The distinction was crucial, and it spoke to an emotional maturity that many men never achieved. "And Emma?" Sarah asked. "How does she fit into this vision of 3 sons?" "Emma is perfect exactly as she is," Marcus said, reaching out to ruffle the little girl's hair. "She would be the daughter I never had, the sister who would teach her brothers about kindness and courage. I'm not asking you to change anything about her, or about yourself. I'm asking if you'll let me join your family as much as I'm asking you to join mine." The concept of joining rather than absorption was revolutionary to Sarah. In her experience, marriage meant a woman disappearing into her husband's life, adapting herself to his needs and expectations. The idea that Marcus saw their union as a true partnership, a blending of equals, was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. "I love James," Sarah said quietly, needing to acknowledge the complications that her first marriage brought to any future relationship. "I know you did," Marcus replied without jealousy or resentment. "And I loved Elena, Our ability to love them doesn't diminish our ability to love each other. If anything, it proves that we know how precious real love is, how worth protecting and cherishing. Emma had grown tired of the serious adult conversation and had returned to her toys, but Sarah noticed that she stayed close to Marcus, occasionally leaning against his solid bulk as if drawing comfort from his presence. The easy way her daughter had accepted this man into their lives was perhaps the strongest endorsement Sarah could ask for. "The danger we're in," Sarah said, voicing another concern. "Judge Morse and his men, the conspiracy we're trying to expose. How can you think about marriage and family when we might not survive the next week?" "Because hope is what keeps us alive," Marcus answered simply. "Because having something to fight for makes us stronger than just having something to fight against. And because I believe that good ultimately triumphs over evil, even when the path is dangerous and uncertain." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all three of them freeze, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the snow. Marcus was on his feet immediately, moving to the window with the fluid grace that always surprised Sarah given his size. "How many?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "2 riders," Marcus said after a moment of careful observation. "Moving slowly, picking their way through the drifts, not moving like men in pursuit, more like Dr. Wright." Sarah felt her pulse slow slightly. If it was indeed the doctor on one of his medical rounds, it might be the opportunity they had been hoping for, but it could also be a trap, Judge Morse using the physician to locate their hiding place. "Emma," Marcus said calmly, "I need you to go into the bedroom and stay very quiet until I tell you it's safe to come out. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded seriously, and gathered Thunder in her arms, understanding without being told that this was a time for obedience rather than questions. Sarah watched her daughter disappear into the back room, then turned to Marcus for guidance. "What do we do?" she asked. "We find out who's really out there," Marcus replied, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "And if it is Dr. Wright, we take the chance we've been waiting for." The riders were closer now, close enough that Sarah could make out details through the window. One was indeed Dr. Wright, his black medical bag clearly visible across his saddle. The other was a young man Sarah didn't recognize, probably an assistant or guide helping the doctor navigate the treacherous post-storm trails. "It's really him," Marcus said, tension leaving his shoulders. "This might be exactly the opportunity we need." Sarah felt a mixture of hope and terror as Marcus prepared to open the door. Everything they had planned, everything they had hoped for, was about to be put to the test. The evidence that had cost James his life was about to be entrusted to a man they barely knew, carried to federal authorities, who might or might not be trustworthy. "Marcus," she said suddenly, catching his arm as he reached for the door latch. "About your proposal, about the promise you made." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes patient and understanding. "You don't have to answer now, Sarah. There's too much happening, too much danger to think clearly about the future." "No," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I need to say this now before we step back into that dangerous world out there." Marcus waited, his attention completely focused on her words. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. And yes, I believe in your promise about 3 sons by spring." The smile that spread across Marcus's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his entire countenance with joy and relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close for a moment that felt like a lifetime, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before James's death. She felt like she was home. "By spring," Marcus whispered against her hair, "you'll carry my 3 sons. I promise you that." Sarah Henderson. The name sounded strange and wonderful in her ears. Sarah Henderson. A new identity, a new life, a new chance at happiness that she had never expected to find. Outside, Dr. Wright called out a greeting, and Marcus reluctantly released Sarah to answer the door. But as he moved to greet their unexpected visitors, Sarah carried with her the warmth of his promise, the security of his love, and the hope that somehow, despite all the dangers that surrounded them, they might actually survive to build the beautiful life he had envisioned. The real test of their love was about to begin, but Sarah no longer felt like she was facing it alone. She had Marcus beside her, Emma safe in the next room, and a future worth fighting for stretching out ahead of them like an uncharted country full of infinite possibilities. Part 5. allies and plans. Dr. Samuel Wright looked older than his 53 years as he climbed down from his horse, the harsh mountain winter having etched new lines around his eyes and deepened the gray in his beard. His companion, a young man of perhaps 25 with the lean build of someone who spent his life outdoors, helped secure the horses while the doctor gathered his medical bag and approached the cabin. "Marcus Henderson," Dr. Wright called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I heard you might be in need of medical attention." Marcus opened the door wider, but kept his rifle visible as a precaution. "Dr. Wright, what brings you up here in such conditions?" "Reports of a family in distress," the doctor replied, his sharp eyes taking in Marcus's defensive posture and the subtle signs that the cabin was currently housing more people than usual. "Though I'm beginning to suspect the situation is more complicated than I was led to believe." The young man with Dr. Wright stepped forward, and Sarah recognized him as someone she had seen around Copper Creek, though she couldn't place his name or occupation. "This is Thomas Clearwater," Dr. Wright said by way of introduction. "He's been helping me navigate the trails since the storm." "Thomas, this is Marcus Henderson." Thomas nodded politely, but Sarah noticed that his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the area around the cabin with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. There was something about his bearing that suggested military experience, despite his youth. "Dr. Wright," Marcus said carefully, "before we proceed, I need to know who sent you up here, and what you were told about our situation." The doctor's expression grew grave as he studied Marcus's face. "I was approached by Judge Morse yesterday evening. He said there were reports of a woman and child in distress, possibly suffering from exposure after being caught in the storm. He asked me to investigate and render assistance if needed." Sarah felt her blood chill at the mention of Judge Morse. If he had sent Dr. Wright, it could be a trap designed to locate their hiding place. But something in the doctor's manner suggested that he was here for reasons beyond just following the judge's orders. "And what did you tell the judge?" Marcus asked. "I told him I would investigate," Dr. Wright replied. "I did not tell him that I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately for quite some time." The admission hung in the air between them, laden with implications that made Sarah's heart race with both hope and fear. Dr. Wright's presence could be exactly the opportunity they had been hoping for, or it could be the trap that destroyed them all. "Thomas," Dr. Wright said to his companion, "would you mind checking on the horses? Make sure they're properly secured against the cold." Thomas nodded and moved away, though Sarah noticed he positioned himself where he could see all approaches to the cabin. Whatever his role in this visit, he was clearly more than just a guide helping an elderly doctor navigate mountain trails. "Mr. Henderson," Dr. Wright said once they had relative privacy, "I know what happened to your family. I know what really caused the mine collapse, and I know that my medical report contributed to covering up the truth." Marcus's grip tightened on his rifle, but his voice remained steady. "Go on." "I've lived with the guilt of that falsified report for 3 years, the doctor continued. "Judge Morse made it clear that my cooperation was not optional, that my medical license and possibly my life depended on ruling.
The death's accidental. I've been looking for a way to make amends ever since." Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus, seeing her own cautious hope reflected in his dark eyes. If Dr. Wright was genuine in his desire to help, he could be the key to getting their evidence to federal authorities. But the risk of trusting him was enormous. "What do you know about Judge Morse's current activities?" Marcus asked. Dr. Wright's expression darkened. "I know he's formed what amounts to a private army to hunt for a woman and child who allegedly stole sensitive documents. I know he's authorized to use any means necessary to recover those materials. And I know that several good men have already died for asking too many questions about territorial mining operations." The doctor's knowledge of their situation was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it suggested he was genuinely on their side. Alarming because it indicated how widespread the search for them had become. "Dr. Wright," Sarah said, stepping into view for the first time, "if you're here to help us, we need to know that we can trust you completely. Too many lives depend on the information we're carrying." The doctor's eyes widened slightly as he took in Sarah's appearance, recognizing her despite the mountain clothing she now wore. "Mrs. Mitchell, I heard about your husband's death. I'm sorry for your loss. Did you examine James's body?" Sarah asked directly. Dr. Wright nodded grimly. "I did, and like the mine collapse that killed the Henderson family, His death was ruled accidental despite clear evidence to the contrary. Sarah felt her throat tighten at the confirmation of what she had always suspected. What kind of evidence? Injuries consistent with a beating before the fall that supposedly killed him, Dr. Wright said quietly. Defensive wounds on his hands suggesting he fought his attackers, and a pattern of broken bones that indicated he was thrown down those stairs rather than falling accidentally. The clinical description of her husband's murder hit Sarah harder than she had expected. To hear the details laid out so matter-of-factly, to know that James had suffered before he died, brought back all the rage and grief she had been trying to control. Marcus moved closer to her, his presence offering silent support as she struggled to compose herself. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Dr. Wright, who seemed to understand the relationship that had developed between them. "Mrs. Mitchell," the doctor said gently, "if you have evidence that could expose the conspiracy that killed your husband, I want to help you get it to the right people. I've been in contact with federal investigators who are already suspicious of territorial mining operations." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing her own cautious optimism reflected in his expression. This could be exactly the break they had been hoping for, the chance to get James's evidence to federal authorities without the dangerous journey to Fort Collins. "What kind of contact?" Marcus asked. Dr. Wright glanced toward where Thomas was ostensibly checking the horses, then leaned closer to speak in lower tones. "Thomas Clearwater is not just my guide. He's a federal investigator working undercover to gather information about corruption and territorial mining operations. He's been posing as a drifter and occasional ranch hand for the past 6 months. The revelation explained the young man's military bearing and his obvious alertness. Sarah felt a surge of hope at the knowledge that federal authorities were already investigating the very conspiracy that James had died exposing. "Can we trust him?" Sarah asked. "With your life," Dr. Wright assured her. "He's risking his own life every day to gather evidence against Judge Morse and his associates. He's the real reason I came up here today. Not because the judge sent me, but because Thomas learned you might be here and suggested this as a way to make contact safely." Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of trusting these men with their lives and their evidence. Sarah watched him think, appreciating the careful way he considered all aspects of their situation before making decisions that could affect them all. "If Thomas is really a federal investigator," Marcus said finally, "then he should know about Colonel Robert Hayes at Fort Collins." Dr. Wright nodded immediately. "Colonel Hayes is leading the federal investigation into territorial corruption. Thomas reports directly to him through coded messages sent via telegraph from various towns throughout the territory." The confirmation that Dr. Wright and Thomas were connected to Marcus's brother was exactly the verification they needed. Sarah felt the last of her doubts dissolve as she realized that Providence had indeed provided them with exactly the help they needed. "Emma," Marcus called softly toward the bedroom. "You can come out now, little one, we have some new friends to meet." Emma emerged cautiously, clutching Thunder in her arms, her dark eyes wide as she took in the strangers who had invaded their sanctuary. She stayed close to Marcus, but her natural curiosity began to overcome her initial shyness. "Dr. Wright," Marcus said formally, "I'd like you to meet my fiancée Sarah Mitchell and our daughter, Emma." The introduction caused Dr. Wright's eyebrows to rise slightly, but he accepted the new family dynamic without comment. Sarah felt a warm glow at hearing herself introduced as Marcus's fiancée, at the easy way he claimed Emma as their daughter. "Thomas," Marcus called to the young man who was still maintaining his watch over the approaches to the cabin. "I think it's time for introductions all around." Thomas approached the cabin, his manner relaxing slightly as he sensed that the initial tension was beginning to ease. Up close, Sarah could see the intelligence in his gray eyes. Thomas Clearwater moved with the controlled precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on observing everything while appearing to notice nothing. As he approached the cabin's entrance, Sarah could see the keen intelligence behind his weathered features, the way his eyes catalogued every detail of their situation while his expression remained carefully neutral. "Agent Clearwater," Marcus said, extending his hand in greeting. "Dr. Wright tells me you're working with my brother's investigation." Thomas accepted the handshake, his grip firm and confident. "Colonel Hayes speaks very highly of you, Mr. Henderson. He's mentioned your family's tragedy several times, always with regret that he couldn't provide assistance when it happened." The mention of Robert's ongoing concern for Marcus's loss seemed to ease some of the tension that had been building in the mountain man's shoulders. Sarah watched as Marcus's expression softened slightly, remembering that he wasn't alone in this fight. that there were good people working within the system to expose the corruption that had claimed so many lives. "What's the current status of the federal investigation?" Marcus asked, gesturing for Thomas and Dr. Wright to come inside where they could speak more freely. Thomas glanced at Dr. Wright, who nodded encouragingly, before responding. "We've been building a case against the Territorial Mining Consortium for 8 months. We have evidence of bribery, falsified safety reports and systematic cover-ups, but we've been missing the kind of documentation that could tie everything together in court." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized the significance of what Thomas was saying. The evidence that James had died gathering might be exactly what federal investigators needed to complete their case. "How much documentation would you need?" she asked quietly. Thomas studied her with renewed interest. "Miss Mitchell, if you have access to the materials your husband compiled before his death, they could be the missing piece that allows us to move forward with prosecutions. Colonel Hayes has been particularly interested in obtaining mining surveys and safety inspection reports that haven't been altered by territorial officials." Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus, seeing her own excitement and caution reflected in his dark eyes. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the chance to ensure that James's sacrifice would not be in vain. "Emma," Marcus said gently, "why don't you show Dr. Wright your wooden animals while your mama and I discuss some important matters with Agent Clearwater?" Emma nodded solemnly, understanding without being told that adult conversations required privacy. She gathered Thunder and his companions, settling near the fireplace where she could still hear the adults talking but wouldn't be directly involved in their discussion. Sarah retrieved her leather satchel, handling it with the reverence due to something that had cost her husband's life and might save countless others. As she unwrapped the carefully protected documents, Thomas's eyes widened with professional appreciation. "These are original mining surveys," he said, accepting the first bundle with obvious excitement. "Unaltered reports from certified territorial engineers. We've been trying to obtain these for months, but they keep disappearing from official files. James made copies of everything before the originals were destroyed or altered," Sarah explained. "He spent months cross-referencing reports, comparing official versions with the engineer's original findings." Thomas examined document after document, his expression growing increasingly grave as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Dr. Wright looked over his shoulder, occasionally pointing out details that confirmed his own suspicions about the systematic nature of the cover-ups. "This ledger," Thomas said, holding up James's careful accounting of bribes and payments, "this could bring down half the territorial government. These names, these amounts, they correspond perfectly with patterns we've observed but couldn't prove." Marcus moved closer to study the ledger alongside Thomas. "That entry there, the payment to Judge Morse just before he ruled on my family's deaths. Is that enough to charge him with conspiracy?" "More than enough," Thomas confirmed. "Combined with Dr. Wright's testimony about being coerced into falsifying medical reports, we can build a case that reaches from territorial officials all the way to federal appointees who were supposed to be overseeing mining safety." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow as she watched these men examine the evidence that James had died protecting. He had been right about the scope of the conspiracy, right about the need to expose it at the federal level, right about everything except his own ability to survive long enough to see justice done. "Mrs. Mitchell," Thomas said, looking up from the documents, "I need you to understand what agreeing to testify will mean. This case will make powerful enemies, people who have already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their interests. If you come forward as a witness, you'll be a target for the rest of your life." "I'm already a target," Sarah replied simply. "Judge Morse and his associates won't stop hunting me as long as these documents exist. The only way Emma and I can ever be truly safe is if the people responsible are exposed and prosecuted." Marcus moved to stand beside her, his presence offering silent support for whatever decision she made. The gesture wasn't lost on Thomas, who seemed to understand that he was dealing with more than just a widow seeking justice for her husband's death. "There's something else you should know," Thomas continued. "The federal investigation has uncovered evidence that the Territorial Mining Consortium has connections to organized criminal enterprises in major eastern cities. This isn't just about local corruption, it's part of a larger network that extends far beyond Colorado territory." The revelation that their local struggle was part of a national pattern of corruption was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. Overwhelming because it suggested the scope of the battle they were facing, comforting because it meant they weren't alone in fighting against these forces. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Marcus asked. How long before arrests can be made? Thomas consulted a small notebook he pulled from his coat pocket. With this evidence, Colonel Hayes believes we can move forward within 2 weeks. Federal marshals are already being positioned throughout the territory, ready to make simultaneous arrests once the warrants are issued. 2 weeks, Sarah repeated, trying to process the magnitude of what that meant. 2 weeks until James's murderers face justice. 2 weeks until the conspiracy that had killed Marcus's family was finally exposed. 2 weeks until she and Emma could stop running and start building a new life. Dr. Wright had been listening to this exchange while occasionally glancing toward Emma, who was completely absorbed in creating an elaborate adventure for her wooden animals. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent carrying guilt about his role in covering up the truth. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Henderson, I want you to know that I'll be testifying about everything I was forced to falsify. The medical reports, the pressure from Judge Morse, the threats made against my practice and my family. It won't undo the damage that's been done, but it might prevent future tragedies. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who was willing to risk everything to make amends for past compromises. She understood the courage it took to admit professional wrongdoing, especially when that admission could destroy a lifetime of work. Dr. Wright, she said quietly, thank you. James would be proud to know that his evidence helped give you the strength to speak the truth. The doctor nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Your husband was a brave man, Mrs. Mitchell. His sacrifice won't be forgotten. Thomas had been studying the documents while they talked, occasionally making notes in his small notebook. When he looked up, his expression was that of a man who had just realized the full scope of what he was dealing with. There's one more thing, he said carefully. The evidence your husband gathered, it includes information about planned expansion of mining operations into sacred Ute tribal lands. This could trigger federal intervention under treaty obligations, adding another layer of legal complications for the consortium. Marcus's expression hardened at the mention of treaty violations. The Ute have already lost too much land to illegal mining operations. If this evidence can help protect what's left of their territory, it's another reason to move forward quickly. Sarah found herself thinking about all the different groups that had been harmed by the Territorial Mining Consortium's activities. Miners and their families, like Marcus's lost loved ones. Investigators like James who had tried to expose the truth. Native peoples whose treaty rights had been violated. The web of harm extended far beyond what she had initially understood. Agent Clearwater, she said, making her decision with the clarity that came from understanding the full scope of what was at stake. I'll testify. I'll do whatever is necessary to ensure that this evidence reaches the right people and that justice is finally served. Thomas nodded approvingly. Colonel Hayes will want to debrief you personally before the trials begin. He'll also want to ensure that you and your daughter have adequate protection during the legal proceedings. What kind of protection? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that made Sarah realize he was thinking about their future together, about the family they hoped to build. Federal marshals, safe houses, new identities if necessary. Thomas explained, the government takes witness protection very seriously, especially in cases involving organized criminal activity. The mention of new identities brought home the reality of what testifying would mean. Sarah Mitchell might disappear forever, replaced by someone with a different name, a different history, a different life. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Would that extend to family members? Marcus asked quietly. To people who choose to build a life with protected witnesses. Thomas smiled slightly, the first truly warm expression Sarah had seen from him. Mr. Henderson, if you're asking whether marrying Mrs. Mitchell would complicate her protection status, the answer is that it would actually strengthen it. Married couples are easier to relocate and protect than single individuals, especially when children are involved. Emma looked up from her toys at the mention of marriage, her dark eyes bright with interest. Are you really going to marry Mama? She asked Marcus directly. Marcus knelt down to her level, his expression serious but warm. I am if she'll have me, and if you approve of the idea. I approve, Emma announced solemnly. But what about the 3 sons you promised? When are they coming? The innocent question made all the adults smile, lightening the mood in a room that had been heavy with talk of conspiracy and legal proceedings. Sarah felt her cheeks warm as she realized that Emma had been listening more carefully to their earlier conversation than she had thought. Well, Marcus said thoughtfully, these things take time, but I believe in keeping my promises, especially the important ones.
Dr. Wright cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should focus on the immediate practical concerns. Agent Clearwater, what's the safest way to get Mrs. Mitchell and her evidence to federal authorities? Thomas had apparently been considering this question while they talked. The original plan was to escort them to Fort Collins, but given the current weather conditions and the number of people searching for them, that might be unnecessarily dangerous. Colonel Hayes could come here instead. Here? Sarah asked, surprised by the suggestion. This location is defensible, easily secured, and known only to trusted individuals. Thomas explained. It would be much safer than trying to travel with Mrs. Mitchell and Emma through territory where Judge Morse's men might be waiting. Marcus looked around his cabin, the sanctuary that had sheltered them for these past few days, and nodded slowly. Robert is welcome here. It would be good to see my brother again, especially under circumstances that might finally bring some justice for Elena and the boys. The mention of Marcus's lost family brought a moment of somber reflection. Sarah thought about all the lives that had been lost, all the families that had been destroyed, all the pain that could have been prevented if the truth had been exposed years earlier. But dwelling on past tragedies wouldn't change them. Only action in the present could prevent future ones. How long would it take for Colonel Hayes to reach us? Sarah asked. 4 days, assuming the weather holds, Thomas replied. He could travel with a small escort of federal marshals, enough to ensure security but not so many as to attract unwanted attention. 4 more days in this mountain sanctuary, 4 more days of safety, of domestic peace, of watching Emma play without fear while planning a future that had seemed impossible just a week ago. Sarah found herself both eager for the Colonel's arrival, and reluctant to see this interlude end. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. Judge Morse and his men, they won't give up easily, and they'll become increasingly desperate as they realize the evidence is slipping beyond their reach. We need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll try to assault this position before federal help arrives. Thomas nodded grimly. I've been thinking the same thing. Dr. Wright and I noticed signs of recent activity on the main trail coming up here. Someone has been scouting this area, probably trying to determine if you're actually here. The news that their hiding place might have been discovered sent a chill through Sarah. She looked toward Emma, who was still innocently playing with her toys, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. How many men could Judge Morse bring against us? She asked. 12, maybe more, Thomas replied. He's been recruiting from among unemployed miners and drifters, offering good money for men willing to ask no questions about their assignments. Marcus's expression hardened as he considered the tactical situation. This cabin can be defended, but not indefinitely against superior numbers. We need to prepare for the possibility of having to fall back to more defensible positions. What kind of positions? Dr. Wright asked, clearly out of his element when it came to military planning. There are caves in the hills behind the cabin, Marcus explained. Natural fortifications that would be almost impossible to assault successfully. If we have to abandon this position, we could hold out there until federal help arrives. The thought of hiding in mountain caves with Emma was terrifying, but Sarah recognized the necessity of having backup plans. These men were thinking clearly about their survival, planning for contingencies that might mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Wright, Thomas said, you and I should head back to Copper Creek before our absence is noticed. We can send word to Colonel Hayes about the change in plans and monitor Judge Morse's activities. What about us? Sarah asked. You stay here, Thomas replied firmly. This is still the safest place for you and Emma. Mr. Henderson knows this terrain better than anyone, and he's demonstrated his ability to protect you. Just be ready to move quickly if the situation changes. As Dr. Wright and Thomas prepared to leave, Sarah found herself feeling oddly emotional about their departure. These men represented the first real hope she had felt since James's death, the first concrete evidence that justice might actually be possible. Agent Clearwater, she said as he gathered his gear, when you see Colonel Hayes, please tell him that his brother is not the broken man he might fear. Marcus has become our protector, our strength, our hope for the future. Thomas smiled and glanced at Marcus, who was helping Emma organize her toys for easy transport if they needed to move quickly. I can see that, Mrs. Mitchell. The Colonel will be pleased to know that his brother has found reasons to engage with the world again. After the two men departed,
The cabin felt strangely quiet despite the presence of 3 people. Emma sensed the change in mood and moved closer to Sarah, seeking comfort without understanding why it was needed. "Mama," she said quietly, "are the bad men coming back?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, while considering how to answer honestly without causing unnecessary fear. "Some bad men might try to come here," she said finally, "but Marcus will protect us, and soon some very good men will come to help us. Everything is going to be all right." Marcus joined them on the rug before the fireplace, his large frame somehow managing to look both gentle and formidable at the same time. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence that had become so reassuring to Sarah over the past few days. "Emma," he said seriously, "do you remember what I promised your mama about 3 sons by spring?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Well, I want to make another promise," Marcus continued. "I promise that no matter what happens in the next few days, no matter what we have to face together, we're going to come through it as a family. You, your mama and me together forever." The simple declaration carried such conviction that Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. This man who had lost everything to the same corruption they were now fighting, was willing to risk his life again, for the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "And the 3 sons?" Emma asked. "Ever practical?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features with warmth and hope. "The 3 sons will come, little one. Love like what your mama and I share. Love strong enough to face down bad men and build new families. That kind of love always creates new life. By spring you'll have the brothers you want, and they'll have the best big sister in all of Colorado territory." As night fell over the mountains and they settled into what might be their last peaceful evening in the cabin, Sarah found herself believing in Marcus's promises with a faith that surprised her. 3 days ago, she had been a desperate fugitive with nowhere to turn. Now she was part of a family, engaged to a man who promised her 3 sons by spring, surrounded by love strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines with the sound of change coming. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and sustained by hope, the giant cowboy had made his vow, and as spring approached across the Colorado mountains, that promise would prove to be more prophetic than any of them dared imagine. By the time federal marshals arrived to escort them to safety, by the time Judge Morse and his conspirators faced justice, by the time new identities allowed them to build a life free from the shadows of the past, Marcus Henderson's promise would be fulfilled in ways that honored both the memory of those lost and the hope of those yet to come. The trembling widow would indeed carry his 3 sons by spring, and their love would become a beacon of hope in a territory finally freed from the corruption that had claimed so many innocent lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.